So, what does the Treaty of Versailles actually say? Well, what it actually says and how it's applied are sometimes is different. One of the things it says in Article 231 of the Treaty of Versailles is that Germany is given sole blame for the war. So there's what we call the war guilt clause. So it says whatever is going to happen in Germany, it was all Germany's fault. The entire war was based on German aggression or whatever, and Germany is at fault for the entire war. And for Germans on the ground, local Germans, they don't understand this at all. They don't really understand the war to begin with, as most people in Europe are were quite unaware of what was really going on or why they were fighting. The Germans, for example, after World War One, couldn't understand why Britain got involved in the war to begin with. They thought they were attacked by the British for no apparent reason. Now, we know from our discussions that Britain joins the war because of Belgium, etc. But the Germans see this as this British aggression. That why they get involved in this conflict, opening it to a wider conflict. So this is something the local Germans don't understand, and when we look at the history of the war, it is curious to blame only Germany for the war. I mean, it starts with an ultimatum by the Austro-Hungarians, for example. So that's one part, and another part of the Treaty of Versailles is in terms of this occupation occupation of the Rhineland, which was not given a determinate date of when that would end, and the Saar Basin. One of the things that they lose is a territory called Alsace-Lorraine. And Alsace and Lorraine were regions that were taken over by the Germans during the Franco-Prussian War that happened 40 years prior to World War One. And if you go into Alsace and Lorraine today, people tell me, those who speak French, that the Alsace and the Lorraines speak French with a German accent. And it became a German-speaking area, but it was one of these historic readjustments, according to the French. They're going to regain this lost territory of these two particular regions. That's another part. So Alsace-Lorraine is given back to France. Germany is blamed for the war. There's this occupation of the Saar Basin and the Rhineland, which might be going indefinitely. And there's a discussion in the treaty that Germany will have to pay the total cost of the war, which would be determined later by a reparations committee. Never says how much, never defines the terms. And when people talk about this harsh treaty and etc., they look to these clauses. But when we look at the records that during the time period, Wilson and others, and Lloyd George and Clemenceau, there's never any kind of agreement as to what that means. As I said earlier, the French mean reparations, meaning to repair the physical damage on the ground, which would be a limited sum. Not necessarily the total cost of against the Allies. Some people see this as going to be a cost of all the debt that the French and the British owe the Americans. So it's not determined, and it's going to be determined at such and such a later date. That's never really going to come into fruition. The Germans, there's going to be some numbers that are going to be put out later, and the Germans will make one small payment following World War One to the Allies, and that's it. And this idea that there's this harsh treatment of Germany following the war never happens. It never comes to fruition. The treaty talks about this idea of reparations, but the actual payment of reparations never really occurs. So they make this one small payment in the early 1920s, and then it's determined that if there was such payments, the Germans would be crushed. So a U.S. plan comes into effect called the Dawes Plan in the early 1920s, 23, 24, etc., where money will be loaned by the U.S. to Germany to pay the British and the French, who can then pay the U.S. Okay, so we have this circular policy. We're going to loan some money. We're going to throw this money into this region, and then that money then will come back to the U.S. And the Dawes Plan really works in the mid-1920s to rebuild Germany. And Germany was on the way to having normalized relations with France and Britain in the late 1920s, and things looked quite cheery, really, in this region during that time period. Today, we look back on World War II, we talk about this idea of the Marshall Plan, and the Marshall Plan works kind of in the same way, but it's generally just throwing money at an area that's been devastated. And the Marshall Plan was hugely beneficial to the U.S. So all this money's going to be thrown in, but who's going to be the suppliers? Well, the suppliers are going to be U.S. businesses in many cases. So after World War II, the Marshall Plan throws money to this area, gets people back on their feet, gets people back working and such. But it also benefited the nation that was giving the money. And the Marshall Plan was not a loan like the Dawes Plan was. Now, this is the problem following the treaty. So the Dawes Plan is going to help rebuild Germany, but when the Depression hits, all is going to change because the U.S. is going to call back all these loans that it made to Germany and other parts of Europe. And that's what's going to crush the economies. That's what's going to lead to right-wing and radical parties to possibly take control. The economic crisis of the Depression is what we need to look at in terms as to how change are going to how there's going to be changes politically in Europe. The treaty is not to blame for that. The treaty, like I said, outlines the very general terms. But what's the key, though, is that there's a perception that the treaty caused many problems. And this perception is going to be manipulated against local populations. And that's what we have to keep in mind, that perceptions are sometimes as strong as realities. The perception that Hitler will, for example, employ against the treaty is going to be something that's going to speak to people. He's going to talk about the treaty being the stab in the back against Germany and such and such. And for those on hard times, looking for an easy explanation of why their nation is in trouble, can point to, it was easy to point to the treaty as being the cause of all the issues. To try to explain economic crises to an average person is quite difficult. Economics is difficult. It's not a science. It's not something that we can easily apply. And so trying to explain, the drops in prices of agriculture and overproduction of such and such and how this affected world markets, that doesn't speak to people. But saying you were stabbed in the back at the Treaty of Versailles, this is what the average person can understand. So let's keep this in mind when we're talking about this treaty. It's the perception that is more important than the reality. What is the Treaty of Versailles responsible for? I would say it's responsible for creating or sanctioning the creation of certain borders based on local events. It's responsible for a handback of some territory, for example, in Alsace and Lorraine. There are specific treaties that change or had more specific requirements. For example, Bulgaria's treaty, the Treaty of Neuilly, had like a specific list of livestock that had to be given to the Allies and such. So we've got to be very careful when we talk about the treaty, but it does create a peace in the end, especially in the West. It ends the war between Germany and the Allies in the West, and that's what the Treaty of Versailles does. It ends the war officially.